This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, Andrew Biswell heads back to the era of the bright young things as he examines Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited with writer, academic and editor Barbara Cooke. Brideshead Revisited, subtitled The Sacred and Profane Memories of Captain Charles Ryder, is perhaps Evelyn Waugh's most famous novel. It follows Ryder as he remembers his life, from his undergraduate years at the University of Oxford in the Golden Age before the Second World War, to his wartime enlistment in the army. His life is coloured by his obsession with the Flytes, an aristocratic Catholic family who live in the stately home of Brideshead. At university, Ryder meets Sebastian Flyte and is seduced by his life of privilege. He then meets Sebastian's sister Julia, with whom he forms a romantic relationship. Waugh's novel is his most nostalgic, but still contains his usual humour. In 99 Novels, Burgess writes, "I've read Brideshead Revisited at least a dozen times, and have never failed to be charmed and moved, even to tears." Evelyn Waugh was born in 1903. At the age of 24, he published his first book, a biography of the artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and the following year he published his first novel, Decline and Fall. 16 more novels followed, including A Handful of Dust, Scoop, and Vile Bodies. Waugh travelled extensively throughout his life and wrote about the places he visited, including Europe, Africa, Guyana, and Brazil. During the Second World War, he served in the Royal Marines, primarily around the Mediterranean and West Africa. After breaking his leg in a parachuting accident in 1943, he was granted leave from his post, which he used to write Brideshead Revisited, the novel that would bring him fame and success. His last novels were the Sword of Honour trilogy, which were published in 1965. He died in 1966. Barbara Cooke is a senior lecturer in English at Loughborough University. She's also co-executive editor of the complete works of Evelyn Waugh, published by Oxford University Press, a series which brings together all of Waugh's published and previously unpublished writing, with comprehensive introductions, contextual writing, and annotations. She's the author of Evelyn Waugh's Oxford, published by the Bodleian Library, and has recently written the introduction to Penguin's new edition of Decline and Fall. Visit the description of this episode for all the relevant links and a list of all the books mentioned. Here's Andrew Biswell, who spoke to Barbara Cooke about Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited in November 2022.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Barbara Cooke to the 99 Novels podcast. Welcome, Barbara, and thank you for agreeing to talk to us about Evelyn Waugh and about Brideshead Revisited in particular. If we could jump straight in, I'm very keen to find out, what was your earliest encounter with Evelyn Waugh's novels, and what did you think of them on your first reading?
Well, I didn't actually start with the novels at all, as it happens. I started with Evelyn Waugh's autobiography. He planned to write a full autobiography taking you from cradle to grave, but unfortunately for him, grave happened sooner than he was expecting. So we only have autobiography taking us up to his 20s. But that autobiography does cover, obviously, his years in Oxford, which are also part of Brideshead Revisited. And so I read that before I read Brideshead. So I was sort of reading about his sort of talking about the parallels between that book and his own life, and the real people who may or may not have inspired some of the characters before I actually came to Brideshead. So I read that as a student, as a third year undergraduate student, and we were taught biography by a chap called Jeremy Truglown, who edited the Times Literary Supplement for most of the 90s. So he's very passionate, and I think that's when I became sort of passionate about life writing, biography writing, sort of fictions inspired by life. So I think from then on, really, I was just sort of fascinated by that sort of interweaving of fact and fiction and life experience, and what that does for a novelist, and particularly what that does for Evelyn Waugh.
Like you, I read A Little Learning quite early on. I think I was still at
Mm,
school,
yeah.
and it's a very odd piece of writing, very forbidding one in many ways. And I'm not sure I finished it. I think I moved
Yeah.
on to the novels with a kind of disappointment about this autobiography where he bangs on about his religious history, and it's a very curious piece of writing. I mean, unlike the novels, unlike Brideshead Revisited, which is much more, I suppose, warm and engaging than some
Mm.
of the non-fiction, perhaps.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have since edited the autobiography for the OUP edition, and it's interesting you found it difficult to read through, because he clearly found it difficult to write. He went over that manuscript a lot more than for his novels. He, redrafted things over and over again, and it was written when he was older, and quite aware himself, I think, that he didn't have the stamina and the fluency that he had when he was writing something like Brideshead. So it's interesting that maybe you were picking up something of that as a reader too.
I think it was a bad place to start. Probably I wasn't, sort of developed enough for it at the time in my middle teens. But Burgess, I mean, turning to the novel in hand, Anthony Burgess suggests in his 99 novels, he says that Brideshead Revisited is essentially a novel about seduction. I think it's a very interesting provocation on Burgess's part. He says Charles Ryder is seduced by Sebastian, then by Sebastian's family, ultimately by God. I wonder what you make of all that. Is that a fair reading, or do you see the novel in different terms?
Well, I think most readers aren't going to argue with the sort of seduced by Sebastian, seduced by the family. That's sort of one of the things I think was frustrating to War a little bit, was that the relationship with Sebastian seems to be the most kind of vivid, glowing part of the book, and the seduction by God seems to be almost sort of, oh yeah, and then that happened. So I think the language is very luxurious language. It's very kind of baroque. I think he talks about baroque in the book as well, the narrator, and so there is a sense in which it, as writing, it kind of seduces the senses and it seduces the mind, I think, and it kind of gets you into that sort of rapturous state of youth when the world is open before you and everything just seems magical. In terms of sort of sexual seduction, oh well, yes, we've got a problem in that in the book, Charles Ryder, the narrator, starts off with this sort of love affair of a sort with Sebastian Flyte, the young Catholic aristocrat, and then we are supposed to believe that after he sort of finished what is sort of framed as a sort of quite youthful, childish infatuation, that he then falls in love with Sebastian's sister, Julia. And that never seems to be quite as exciting as the Sebastian affair. And there's some sort of awful language about him and Julia when they actually consummate their relationship, which is the most sort of unsexy sex scene anywhere ever. It talks about narrow loins, and it's not very attractive. But then the sort of the idea of faith as a seduction. A seduction, I don't think is quite the right word. It's more of a sort of acceptance. It's a different kind of love. I mean, you could also sort of frame it as the movement between different kinds of love in the novel. Sort of the young, excited kind of erotic, sexual love, then the kind of romantic love, in the sort of love of partnership, through to the sort of theological love for the church. So it might be. I guess I don't have a massive problem with that description of the book, but I think you're right in saying it is a kind of provocative statement, and I'm not sure a Catholic would talk about being seduced by the church necessarily. More that you're going back to it. It is sort of inevitable that you will go back to the church.
Yes, and that seems to be the argument of the very long concluding section, the twitch upon the thread, that Charles is somehow, well, Charles and Lord Marchmain are being sort of drawn inexorably into the orbit of the church. I need to qualify what I've already said by explaining that Burgess, he was very fond of Brideshead Revisited. It's one of his favourite novels in this selection. He also says, more positively, I suppose, that it's a readable, it's a magical novel, he says, which has often moved him to tears. And this sets me wondering whether the appeal of this book to readers, which is obviously very wide and international, is maybe primarily an emotional one, that it speaks to certain feelings of faith, feelings of nostalgia, rather than, for example, being a novel that we read for the plot or perhaps for more intellectual reasons. I just wonder what you make of all that.
Yeah, it's certainly an emotional novel for sure. Yeah, and I think that is sort of part of the faith thing as well. You know, this idea of believe as much as you can. Sort of have faith and believe as much of it as you can, which was a kind of struggle for Waugh personally, I think, because he was a man who was very into logic and order and rational argument. So for him, the leap of faith is an emotional leap, and it's a kind of surrender to not necessarily being able to understand everything, but it just sort of surrender that need in faith. So it is a very emotional novel, and it was written at an extremely emotional time. He was mid World War II service. He felt that the world of his youth had gone forever. That's quite often sort of described as, the world of the country house and the aristocracy. And like, well, yes, but that's only part of it, really. It's also about a kind of loss of innocence and sort of optimism about the future and kind of uncomplicated relationships with people. So it's not just about, oh, these big houses won't be there anymore. So that's the sort of nostalgia part of it. Oh, if only we could go back to that time, and a very short space of time, in fact, sort of in the character's late teens, early 20s. So there's a sort of yearning, it's a kind of very yearning type of nostalgia going on there. In terms of plot, yeah, it's not a page turner for that reason, but in terms of how Burgess saw his 99 novels, he talks, doesn't he, a lot about books that are driven by character, and characters not always doing what you think they might. And actually, that is one reason why he's one of the rationales behind his list. And Brideshead certainly fits that because it's absolutely driven by character. And you're talking about the inevitability of Charles Ryder and Lord Marchmain being sort of pulled back to the faith. But yes, it's like what the characters do or quite often choose not to do as well, that kind of guides the narrative and guides the course of their lives. And Waugh would say their spiritual salvation as well. So it's certainly very character driven, and that does cut very deep, actually. And this idea of emotion and obligation riding out over kind of material or sort of temporal happiness. So you have Julia ultimately rejecting Charles as a husband because she knows it's wrong in the eyes of her faith. So there's a lot of kind of personal self-sacrifice going on in it as well. So yeah, I do find it a page turner because you can sort of see what's coming and you're kind of drawn into it. There's you talked about the twitch upon the thread, but there's also this metaphor used of someone who's in a cabin, and the cabin is getting sort of covered in snow, and the snow is building up so quietly that they don't even notice until the roof falls in. So there's that going on as well, this sort of slow build up of what the characters feel that they will eventually be drawn to do and compelled to do, but they don't notice it happening until it's happened, as it were. So I think for all those reasons, I find it compelling, but certainly not in a kind of car chase thriller explosion way, but more kind of emotionally explosive.
We'll come back to character. There's more to be said on that, I'm sure. But the other thing I wanted to raise was preface to the book, written in 1959, towards the end of his life. He suggests, as he's revising his novel, which is written during the Second World War, he says it was the product of an age of rationing and austerity, and he worried and wondered whether he'd overwritten the passages about eating and drinking because those lavish feasts that are described here were no longer available at the time when he was writing it. It's an interesting self-reflection on Waugh's part. I wonder how far that comment helps us to understand his novel.
Yeah, it helps you understand a war as well as the novel. He often spoke about his regret that you couldn't really change a book after it had been published. He wanted to carry on working on things. He was a perfectionist. He was always sort of working away at them, and it always frustrated him if he had something published and then later thought, well, I wouldn't put it like that now, or sort of that was a mistake, or I shouldn't have, or makes plans for revisions that sometimes happen in later editions and sometimes don't. So with Brideshead, you have a very interesting case where you in some ways have two versions of the same novel. There's huge cuts made in the later edition, and and some of that kind of very purple prose, that sort of luxurious language is stripped down. And I think the struggle of that for me is like, well, yes, that might be what Waugh later felt about it and what he felt about it from a different standpoint. After the war, civilization as he knew it has not quite crumbled away in exactly the way that he thought it would. But the book, for me, has to be understood as a project undertaken in wartime conditions, creating this very rich fantasy world of what is not possible or wasn't possible at the time. It's got that escapism. I think there's a reason it becomes popular as a book when times are straightened. We haven't mentioned the TV series yet, the 1980s Granada TV series, but I think it's something very telling about in times of recession and hardship, that kind of very kind of copious, excessive language and excessive plot becomes appealing to people. So I think if you take out that language, you're removing something of the context in which it was created, and I think that is part of the book's charm and its exceptionalism, really.
It's very interesting to think of potentially readers might be reading two not different novels, but not identical either. That these textual changes are clearly significant and substantial.
Yeah, they are very much so, and so then you always have the decision of, do you read the thing that Waugh wanted when he was a bit older and, with a bit more hindsight, or is it, I don't think there's an answer. I don't think one is truer than the other, as it were. I think they just reflect his attitude to a period of his life from different moments when he was looking back. I mean, it is quite interesting that as a younger man, his depictions of Oxford in particular, nothing like as positive as they are in Brideshead. When he was writing as a student and when he'd recently left the university, he was a lot more cutting. There's a lot more of the kind of characters in it that you encounter. His wife Celia's awful brother, Boy Mulcaster, and these sort of what they call the hearties, might call jocks, or there's a lot more of kind of scathing writing going on, like saying something like Decline and Fall, his first novel, where you have a sort of loutish culture. You have Waugh kind of really sticking the boot into entitlement and sort of oafishness and stupidity. So again, so you've got him as a young man being quite critical about Oxford, then you've got this kind of rhapsodic phase in the middle here. And then you have him kind of stepping back from that again when life is not quite so dangerous or doesn't feel quite so precarious as well. So yeah, whenever you meet an author at whatever stage in their life, I mean, there's going to be differences, and I'm a big believer in the sort of not the life determining the work by any degree, but the type of work that is produced is certainly affected by the author's position at the time to the thing that they're writing about, and that can change, and particularly in the middle of the 20th century when life is changing so fast as well.
It's very interesting you mentioned Oxford, because people sometimes talk about Brideshead Revisited as an Oxford novel. which of course it is in part. But reading it again in preparation for this conversation, I'm very struck by how much of the action takes place in other places, not least at Brideshead, the house, another potential sort of seduction going on there. But you've also got Venice. There's quite a lot of the actions happening in London, Paris, I think Marrakesh, an ocean liner in the middle of the Atlantic, and Brideshead. We've mentioned the place, the house itself. Are we doing a disservice to this novel if we try to locate it within a canon of fiction about Oxford and the university there?
Well, I think if we only look at the Oxford sections, which, as you say, make up considerably less than half the book, I suppose you could say that we're not looking at the full potential of the book, and especially if you think that war meant it primarily as a sort of journey of a family towards faith or a return to faith, then Oxford is really just happens to be the place where Sebastian and Charles meet. But at the same time, Oxford has this pull on Waugh's imagination. He writes about the city over and over again, well, particularly the university rather than the city, and sort of comes up in different guises. But not only was he affected by his own experience at Oxford, but he was also affected by the anticipation of it. His father had gone to Oxford. He decided that he wanted to go. He was obsessed with the book Alice in Wonderland. It was one of his favourite books, and that book is itself very much a product of Oxford, particularly in its wonder and its fascination. And there are a lot of sort of references to Alice in Brideshead. All the idea about sort of getting through the grey walls into the secret garden beyond, this idea that the young undergraduate starts off leading quite a drab sort of life until he finds his way into the kind of metaphorical magical garden. I mean that is all kind of Alice in Wonderland inspired. That is itself a product of the geography in which it was written. So I think that Oxford is really important to the production of the book as well as the content of the book. But then Oxford has a monopoly. There are so many books that are sort of set there or feature characters who've been to Oxford. Thinking about Gaudy Night, which is another one of my absolute favourite books, in the Lord Peter Wimsey series, but this one features mostly Harriet Vane and a women's college in Oxford, which is absolutely wonderful mid-century book. So I think there's a lot of factors that make us think of it as an Oxford book. There's the fact that that's the place where young people go and enjoy a lot of freedom from the social restrictions that were placed upon them outside of Oxford, particularly true in the 1920s, particularly if you were a guy who liked guys, for example, that was okay in Oxford where it wasn't elsewhere. So that there are a lot of reasons why it's that location makes things possible that wouldn't be possible elsewhere. But yeah, you're right, obviously the majority of the book doesn't happen in Oxford, but yeah, you never hear it described as a Venice novel, but you do hear it described as a country house novel. I mean, it is seen as a really important milestone in novels about the country house too, and that's the Brideshead setting, of course, Brideshead Castle.
Very interesting to think more about the relationship between Sebastian and Charles. And for its time, this seems remarkably unworried about same-sex desire, which is clearly, there are laws against it at the time the novel's written and published. And from what we now know of Waugh's biography, thanks to Martin Stannard and others, it's clear that he has a foundational experience of being in love with another man at the time that he's a student. And this is, to some extent, reflected in his narrative. It's a very bold presentation. I mean, maybe it's not primarily, as Waugh represents it, a sexual relationship, but it's clear that things are going on, that Charles is entirely enchanted by this charismatic figure of Sebastian.
Yeah, and then you get the problem, as I mentioned, of we're meant to believe that he then falls in love with Julia, and he refers to Sebastian as the forerunner. and you're reading the book, you're thinking, you seem much more, full of delight and joy in this sort of same-sex relationship. Yeah. So Waugh, he didn't just fall in love with one guy at Oxford. He was fully in love with at least two men, and he was part of a social circle where it was completely normal to have these romantic relationships with men. There was a sort of drinking club called the Hypocrites Club, which was in St Aldate's in Oxford, and it was a sort of drinking den. And we have sort of eyewitness accounts of men sort of being sexually together in that club, like just in a kind of any sort of studenty nightclub you might find. So yeah, and you're right, it was completely illegal to have a sexual relationship with another man at the time, and that wouldn't change until after Waugh actually died. So he himself was quite open about his sexuality within his friends, within his friendship groups, like more so than you might imagine, and didn't seem to have a particular problem with talking about finding men attractive whilst being in a heterosexual, very successful marriage. So, I mean, there are people that have over the years sort of tried to kind of describe his sexuality according to different terms. Tom Dryberg, for example, wrote a memoir called Ruling Passions that came out just after homosexuality was decriminalised in England. And his account of the same time and the same group of people at Oxford is more explicit. And he sort of talks about Waugh being kind of suppressed in some way, that he was a bisexual man who couldn't live as he chose. And this caused him all kinds of problems. But I'm not quite convinced by that. I think he was comfortable. I think he was not sort of officially comfortable. He didn't want to have the quote unquote lifestyle that he would have had to have if he openly was in sexual relationships with men. But he never really seemed to have a problem saying he was attracted to other men, for example. So, in a way, I think the way he saw his sexuality is in some ways more similar to the way we do now in the sort of 2020s than perhaps we did 20, 30 years ago. We seem to be more like sort of willing to kind of think about people's sexuality as being much more of a spectrum, much more fluid than perhaps people needed to see it when those rights and those battles were being very fiercely fought towards the end of the 20th century.
Yeah, and as I say, it's remarkable for a book of this time, published 1945, that it's completely true to the experience and the memory of what's obviously been happening at that time in that place. We should say, in case we've not mentioned it already, this is also a comic novel. And I think that too is important to Burgess's apprehension of it. You've got these larger-than-life characters. Charles's father is a great source of comedy. Also, Mr. Samgrass, the academic, Anthony Blanche, Rex Mottram, and others who you've mentioned already. But a broader question arising from that: how important is that kind of, I'd call it almost grotesque comedy to Waugh's fictional world, do you think?
Oh, hugely, yes. Grotesque is the word. I think I've also described it as sort of a burlesquing as well. It comes out of so many different traditions of literature and sort of stage writing as well. There's quite a lot about the sort of Shakespearean clown sometimes about his characters, and it's interesting because people quite often separate his books into kind of comedy and not comedy. So you've got kind of early comedies in the late 1920s going through the 1930s, Decline and Fall and Vile Bodies, for example. Then you've got sort of later on a book that I've just been working on, The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, which is again considered sort of comedic, which is from 1957. And then you've got the more supposedly devotional books, so Brideshead being the most famous, but he also wrote Helena, which is about the finder of the true cross on which Jesus was crucified. It's a historical novel. But these sort of supposedly kind of devotional or sort of dramatic or serious books, that you're right, they absolutely have these sort of amazing comedy set pieces. Charles Ryder's father is just the social comedy. I mean, he does things like refuses to sort of be corrected. He'll decide one of Charles's friends is, I think, American, and he's sort of told he's not American, but he kind of refuses to accept the fact. So he's all talking about, oh, of course you must feel like that being over here, and of course, very, it'd all be very different for you at home. It's like, no, I'm from, and he does it to make his son feel uncomfortable. And I think there is always discomfort in the humour, even in those sort of broadly kind of grotesque books. I think one of my favourite scenes that brings all that together is in A Handful of Dust, 1934, I think. And that's a very tragic book about all sorts of things. One of the things it's about is the breakdown of a marriage. And there's this whole farcical section where the husband has to do the decent thing and make it possible for his wife to divorce him, because she would lose her character if he divorced her. So he has to go to a hotel with a prostitute so that a detective can witness this and then give evidence for the divorce. But the young sex worker has to bring her child with her because she has no one to look after her child. So this sort of supposed sort of lewd weekend becomes a kind of family trip to the seaside, and it's just, the comedy is just on point, but it's making a really serious kind of comment as well about the ridiculousness of the divorce laws and what counts as decent behavior and not. And there's a character in that as well, the character's brother-in-law, so the brother of this woman who wants a divorce. And there's just a scene where he's eating in a restaurant and it's a delicious meal, and he eats literally everything on his plate, including the bones of the meat that he's been served. And he does it absolutely deadpan, and it's disgusting and weird, but very funny as well. In a very unique way. I haven't found anyone else I know of who can write that kind of disgust and horror alongside comedy quite as well as Evelyn Waugh.
It's interesting, that aspect of social satire, I suppose, and the business of the divorce in A Handful of Dust echoed here. It's very interesting for me to learn that if you're a divorced couple and you were remarrying at the time the book is set, you did it at the Savoy Chapel, back of the Savoy Hotel in the 1920s. And the last time I was down in London, I sought it out because I've been reading about it here. It's perfectly respectable, by all accounts. It must be something about the association of the hotel, because that's where they went for the celebration afterwards. But I think Waugh, as a great observer of the social scene, he wants to cram all this in and sort of tell you about the texture of the time. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Always with an eye for the absurd or the ironic.
Yeah.
And in that sense, this book, though it seems different from the early fiction, is of a piece with those earlier books, which the kind of purely comic novels, as it were, which I suppose established him in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, he's got an excellent ear for dialogue, and you can hear that in Brideshead as well. You mentioned Rex Mottram, who is this very objectionable character who is highly capitalist, kind of very, money focused individual, and it has sort of fascist leanings. So this is in periods of the book that are set in the build up to World War II. And he's got all his horrible friends over to Brideshead Castle, and they're discussing very confidently amongst themselves how there's not going to be a war. And just the way that he sort of builds line upon line from horrible man to horrible commentator, sort of like, oh no, of course it won't happen. And then he just leaves the chapter with, one of these statements sort of just dangling there with the sort of the most understated dramatic irony. It's just, masterful, absolutely masterful.
Yeah, I'm looking at my notes. When Rex first comes into view, I've written, he is flashy and thick. But of course, his other things as well. Slimy. You feel like you need a shower after sort of reading the scenes he's involved in. And that's another, I suppose, aspect of Waugh, really sort of going to town with the grotesque.
Well, and then the insincere. It's the insincerity of I think because one of the sort of characters who comes out of the whole novel best is Cordelia, the very deliberately named youngest sister of Sebastian Flyte. who is just always totally direct, and she has great fun with Rex because he is willing to convert to Catholicism to marry Julia Flyte. This is before they realise, as you've just been talking, that he's been married before, and he is, with his obtuseness, doesn't realise that he has been married in the eyes of the church and therefore cannot be married again unless his first wife dies. But so he's taking instruction for Catholicism, and Cordelia just gives him all this nonsense that's just not canon, and and he's just like, really? Do you really do that? And he's very and the priests get very frustrated with him because he will just do whatever he's told. He'll believe whatever he's told, but without, it's the completely other end of the scale to war, because the priest would be like, don't you have a problem with like reconciling this or this? He said, no, father, as long as you tell me it's true, that's good enough for me. And because it just doesn't go deep, it's just all mechanical for him. It's transactional, and that is unforgivable in Waugh's universe.
You mentioned earlier that this novel, Brideshead Revisited, has been adapted, first of all, as the television series, the John Mortimer series, in 1981, and it's also been remade as a feature film since then with Ben Whishaw, etc. Funnily enough, when it was on the TV in the 80s, Burgess was called in as some sort of expert in Catholic writing to review it. He quite liked the TV adaptation. And wrote very admiringly. He said it was faithful to the book, though he got his doubts about the what he calls the sort of outrageous, preposterous plot. I wonder if you've any thoughts about either the TV series or the film that comes later, and how they sort of either leave out or sort of emphasize particular aspects of the novel itself.
Yes, so the TV series is pretty much verbatim from the book. I think the things the characters say are hardly changed at all, if at all. And that's one of the reasons why it's a very long series, particularly for the time. And an absolutely huge budget went into it. And it is beloved, isn't it? It's sort of it's a canonical, and they filmed it at Castle Howard. So for lots of people, Castle Howard is Brideshead Castle, and yeah, he certainly took some features of that building. But Brideshead is a composite. There are other buildings. Paula Byrne has written about Madresfield Court, for example, and its connection to Brideshead Castle. But because of that TV series, that sort of cemented the sort of the glass dome on the top of Castle Howard is sort of iconic and become as much part of the narrative as anything else. So yeah, it was a labour of love and rightly acclaimed. They say the preposterous plot, like you say, I mean, well, it's the same plot as the book, and I'm not sure which bit he found particularly preposterous, maybe the deathbed conversion. But I mean, Waugh did actually witness that happening to somebody he knew. So I don't know. I mean, nothing is more ridiculous than real life, perhaps. But yeah, the later film, oh dear. I believe there are plans to kind of redo it as a TV series again. I'm not sure how far they've got, but I'm quite looking forward to seeing what's done with that. Because, yes, I suppose there are things you can emphasize now, but we were just talking about the kind of sexuality. And actually, I mean, there is a reason why it's not explicit in the book, because I think it is important for readers to be able to kind of fill that space of ambiguity themselves. And in the film, I can totally see why they decided to have Sebastian and Charles having an openly sexual relationship in the film. They have them swimming naked in the fountain, I think, and all sorts. And yes, okay, I think it's well intentioned, but I think it, to be honest, loses some of the subtlety of the book, and it does chop about with the plot a lot as well. So I don't think the Ben Whishaw film, amazing as Ben Whishaw is, love him. I think it got quite mixed reviews, and I think that's justified. But I would like to see someone do it again now. I think long enough has passed since the Granada TV to give a different perspective on what is at heart the same story. I think it's time. There's been some interesting work, kind of creative work, sort of taking Brideshead as inspiration as well, which is it's good. I think it's a bit of an evergreen text. I think there's always more to discover in it and more to show.
And just as Waugh himself went back to it and wanted to sort of rework it, I suppose that's reflected in this process of adaptation, that maybe each generation is kind of with the visual adaptations creating its own version of his rightly famous novel.
Yeah, well, Bryony Lavery recently did a stage production of Brideshead as well. She's very very talented practitioner who was behind Warhorse as well. I spoke to her about her. She just constantly reread the book, cover the book in notes, and I think if that's where you start from, I think whatever you end up with is going to be worth looking at. I think one of the mistakes of the film is I think the director is on record as saying he thought that Catholicism was the enemy in the story, and I'm like, well, if you go into it with that view, then the film that you make won't be Brideshead. It could be something very interesting and very good, but as we've just been talking about, the whole driving force of the narrative is the inevitability of surrendering one's worldly interest to the good of the church. And if you don't see that, it's going to be difficult to make good art. I don't know. That's just my opinion. I'm very happy to be proved wrong. Very happy.
Maybe stepping sideways or slightly backwards from the novel. I know that you've been working on a range of different books by Evelyn Waugh as part of the collected works project, and I wanted to ask, what have been the most surprising or the most interesting things you've found out about Evelyn Waugh through your involvement in that project?
Yeah, the personal letters, the personal writings are a revelation. I think prior to our project, only about 15% of them had been published. And obviously, we've got sort of something like 10,000 items. So publishing them all is a massive undertaking. So obviously, it's perfectly reasonable to do an edited collection and show some of the highlights. But I think you've always got a problem with how can you be truly representative of a person if you've only got 15% of the material available. And when you look at his writing in the round, his extraordinary kindness comes through. Yes, he had an awful temper. He was mercurial, unpredictable. Um, some of the things we're talking about in that are sort of played for laughs in the books are things that he would, perhaps enact in his own life to less amusing effect. But he gave a lot of his money away. He supported a lot of charitable causes, but also financially supported a lot of his friends who were on, running into hard times. So, he's sort of propping people up, sending them either money or just little gifts and things quite often to keep them going. He writes, and there's a sort of, he hated his children, he was a bad father, but he was a great letter writer to his children. He gave them some excellent advice in his letters. There's a great letter he writes to his one of his elder daughters, Margaret, and he's talking about, I wish you would rest. I don't mean just sitting doing nothing. I mean doing whatever it is you have to do in a kind of spirit of calmness. And basically, he's talking about mindfulness, right? And he's like, that is real rest. And there's a lot of wisdom there. And he was very insecure as well. So he was kind of very, he sort of kept people at arm's length. But if someone said he was boring or kind of, it really cut deep, and it made him not want to go out. So that kind of vulnerability that you see in the letters as well. He doesn't strike one as a very vulnerable character in the front he put on for the world, but he was incredibly complicated. So I like complicated characters. I like working on people who you're not necessarily sure you'd want to meet in real life, but maybe you would and you'd have a great time. But just to have that kind of complexity and depth, I think is something that you see when you have the privilege of looking at a full run of very well preserved materials.
Thank you. And of course, we'll look forward to your own edition of The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold to find out more about those complexities, I'm sure.
Well, I hope so, yeah.
Now, indeed. Burgess writes in the novel now that he says Waugh's best novel is not Brideshead Revisited, but A Handful of Dust. And I wonder where you think this novel, Brideshead, stands in relation to his other work, especially the fiction?
It's funny, you know, when people like a band and quite often they say, "Oh, I only like their early material." I I kind of feel that that's a bit like, you know, when saying, "Oh, Handful of Dust is the best novel." It's like if you know War a bit, you say your favourite novel's Brideshead, but if you really know War, you say it's A Handful of Dust, and it is a masterpiece. It's an incredible novel. Um, Brideshead, it caught the zeitgeist, basically. It caught, we talked about it being an emotional book, and we talk about it, whatever people find in it is something that people really needed at the time. And that isn't necessarily always down to sheer literary prowess or, you know, or technique, or it's not necessarily something that can be planned. It's something that kind of happens, um, you know, and it's to do with those sort of unique conditions in which it was produced. So I think that's what makes it special. And it opened up a huge readership for Evelyn Waugh in the United States. He wasn't particularly well known in the United States before Brideshead, but you know the American Catholic readership really went for it, and it was extensively reviewed in Catholic newspapers and in periodicals in the States. So I think it's the book of wars that belongs most to the world, and I think that's why people love it. And I do find it endlessly fascinating. So, uh, I mean, you very kindly haven't asked me what you think his best book is, so I'm not going to make you know, a rod for my own butt by trying to answer the question. But I think I like caustic Waugh. I like Waugh who kind of has an eye on the world and sees right through you. And I think A Handful of Dust certainly does that. It's a bleaker book than Brideshead, so it's a bit less compromising, I suppose, and so I like it. But it's like, you know, do you do you like a sweet rosé or a dry rosé? Well, I like my rosé, you know, bone dry, so I like Handful of Dust. Yeah, Brideshead's more of your Zinfandel, maybe.
That's a very good answer. Thank you. And there's one question we ask everyone who comes on the 99 Novels podcast, which is which novel you would like to add to Burdess's list of 99 and why you would like that book to be, you know, sort of added.
Yeah, I've been pondering this one a lot, and I thought, well, first of all, do I stay with Burgess's time period? So do I stay between 39 and, is it 1984, 84,
Right?
83?
Yeah.
So there are a few contenders. I'm sorry that there's no Agatha Christie on his list, because for similar reason for Brideshead, I think in terms of zeitgeist and really capturing popular imagination and just being brilliant, I think I would like to see Crooked House on there. I think Dodie Smith's I Capture the Castle is another one that I think really deserves a place. A very interesting kind of history. But I think what I'm plumping for in the end is a Kenyan novel called A Grain of Wheat. And it was written by somebody called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who studied in the UK, but wrote about Kenya. And it's set on the day of Kenyan independence, but it tells quite a lot of the story in flashback to the time of national emergency in Kenya and various uprisings. And it's a story of a village, but every character in it has sort of their own motivations, their own relationship to the changing regime, and it does also have a cracking plot. You know, it has a kind of mystery element to the plot of, you know, who has betrayed who, and you know who really loves who, and you know, so it's kind of, it's got a lot of that intrigue, but it's got a really, it's very important book politically, and it's a real landmark text in sort of English language writing in Africa. So for that reason, I think that one just pips Agatha Christie and Dodie Smith, though maybe if it was 102, I'd have them as well.
I think we'll settle for the 102. That's extremely generous of you.
Oh, great.
Thank you very much for guiding us through Brideshead Revisited and for recommending these additional novels as well. And thank you for coming on the podcast, Barbara.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Evelyn Waugh's Oxford by Barbara Cooke is out now and available from all good bookshops. You can find more information about the complete works of Evelyn Waugh at Oxford University Press's website, or by clicking the link in the description of this episode. For more information about Anthony Burgess and to find out how you can support the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts?